Origins and Homocysteine reaction. This is Trench Warfare in World War I, the Great War Special, by the channel The Great War. The prevalent conduct of war was on the Western Front of the First World War is unmistakably trench warfare. Yeah. Western Front, yeah, it's mostly trench warfare that we see right now when we visualize a trench warfare. That's the Western Front of World War I, definitely, between the French, Belgium, German border. These trenches with knee-deep mud are a war theater as well as home to the soldiers. That's just fucked up. But how does it look like inside a trench? How is it constructed? This is in-depth video on the trenches. It's going to be fun because, for 4 years, trenches, the horrible condition of trenches, were home to lots of soldiers, right? Trench between the French-German border was extremely long, surprisingly long, right? In that they created so many different type of trenches, zigzag trenches, rooms and things to house people, and it was just horrible, right? Bombardments were happening, mud, raining. God, I don't know if I could survive things like that. This is one of those type of thing, right? One of the most extreme version of those games, so that you see, right? Where if you survive this, you'll win $1 million, something like that. This is extreme version of that, and none of them win any $1 million. So yeah, that's this one.
When people think of the First World War, one of the very first images that comes to mind is of soldiers in the filthy, muddy trenches, fighting, smoking, or just being miserable. So today, here's a special episode of our show about the war in the trenches.
This intro never gets old.
I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to the Great War. The First World War began and ended with a great deal of movement and huge offensives. However, it remains typified by its lack of movement and the years of stalemate on the Western Front, and the trenches were the front lines. But behind them were a mass of supply lines, training establishments, storage, workshops, headquarters, and all the other essentials of war where the majority of troops were employed. The idea of digging into the ground for protection was not a new idea or unique to the Great War. It was, for example, widespread in the U.S. Civil War and the Russo-Japanese War. Trench warfare in World War I began in September 1914, just after the Battle of the Marne, north of Paris. The Germans pulled back to the Aisne River and dug into their positions. The British and the French followed suit. What we saw over the following 2 months is known as the Race to the Sea, as trench lines grew and grew northward toward the Channel and the North Sea, and each side tried to outflank the other to gain an advantage. By the end of November, there was a continuous line of trenches between Switzerland and the North Sea.
How do you process that? From Switzerland, and it's not even straight line. Look at how zigzag it goes. From Switzerland to all the way to Belgium's end border, at the waters basically. How long of a trench that is? That's literally eastern side of France, right? It's covered in trenches. Damn. How many soldiers? What is the condition in that? 4 years straight? This is just fucked up. It's surprising to see, that, obviously trenches were not started in World War I, but, it was in the U.S. Civil War and things like that. But obviously it just went all the way up to 11 in this one, with all the gas attacks and just all the ridiculous things people were using to kill each other.
At first, the trenches were little more than foxholes or ditches, intended for short battles. As the stalemate continued, however, it became obvious that a more elaborate system was needed. Now, although the specific construction of a trench was determined by the local terrain, most were built according to the same basic design. The front wall of the trench, the parapet, averaged around 10 feet high. It was lined with sandbags from top to bottom and also had 2 or 3 more feet of sandbags stacked above ground level. In parts of Italy, trenches were dug in rock, in Palestine in sand. In France, the trenches ran through towns and villages, industrial works, coal mines, brickyards, across railway tracks, through farms, fields, and woods, across rivers, canals, and streams, and each feature...
Across rivers, what the fuck? I mean, imagine, those trenches moved around through town to town, right? Imagine those townsfolk just a few years ago, never thinking what's gonna happen soon. And for 4 years straight, that town is going to be caught in no man's land, basically. Between trenches, German and French trenches, I guess.
Presented its own set of challenges for the men who had to dig in and defend. The front line of a trench facing the enemy was called the main fire trench. It's not a straight line and it's dug in sections, so if an artillery shell explodes in one section, or bay, only that section is affected. Behind that is another line called a support line. Now here you find dugouts cut into the side of the trench wall, often very small, but with room for maybe 3 or 4 men to squeeze in for shelter, or for a telephone position. Communications trenches linked the rear areas with the forward lines, and it was along these that all men, equipment, and supplies were transported. Probing out from the front line were further trenches called saps, which often went beyond the protective belts of barbed wire and terminated somewhere in no man's land in a listening post manned by 1 or maybe 2 infantrymen. Now the distance between enemy trenches varied from as little as 30 to several hundred meters, and if you captured an enemy trench, you had a new problem: how to turn it around, as you now needed a protected front in what had been the enemy's unprotected rear. See? Soldiers were regularly rotated through a basic trench cycle, fighting in the front line, followed by time in the support lines, then being in reserve, then a rest period. And the daily trench routine was something like this. An hour before dawn, those that were sleeping were woken to stand to. Everyone fixed bayonets and readied himself to guard against a dawn raid by the enemy. Both sides carried out their respective stand-tos, and despite the knowledge that each side was prepared, it was still at this time that many attacks were carried out. As the light grew, this daily ritual was accompanied by the morning hate. This was when both sides relieved the tension of the early hours with indiscriminate machine gun fire and heavy artillery shelling. Following stand 2, the men would have their breakfast and clean their weapons. The cleaning would be done in shifts though, with only a few of the men cleaning their weapons at any one time. Then came the daily inspection. Weapons would be checked, as would the men's clothing. This inspection would include a foot inspection for signs of trench.
Damn, look at that. Organizing this level scale of things. People don't think about this when they think about trench warfare, but yeah, you can't have this kind of a mass scale trench warfare without somewhat organizing things like that, right? When to take a break, when to take weapons, when to eat food. They had all the system for it. This all started just as few holes, right? Just to dig in good enough to have some kind of a small battle. Nobody was prepared to dig in for a long time, but they had to. Trench warfare probably happened before World War I, but not at this type of trench warfare, not at this scale, not at this kind of a systematic trench warfare at least.
Trench foot. Now, trench foot was a medical condition peculiar to trench life. It was a fungal infection of the feet caused by cold, wet, and unsanitary trench conditions, and could turn gangrenous and result in amputation. Some 20,000 casualties from trench foot are said to have been suffered by the British Army by the end of 1914, although as trench conditions improved in 1915, it rapidly faded. Daily chores were then assigned. These could be filling the sandbags, repairing duck boards, pumping out the water that had gathered, digging latrines, and so forth. This was followed along the lines by the daily boredom. Movement was restricted in the trenches to what was essential, so when men were not engaged in a specific chore, they settled down to time-killing activities, reading, writing letters, maybe grabbing whatever sleep they could. In the middle of war, the boredom was often crushing. With the dusk came another round of standing to, exactly the same procedure as at dawn. And with the onset of darkness, the men would be ordered to stand down, and the night's work of resupply, maintenance, and sentry duty would begin. Now, sentry duty was never more than 2 hours, as there was a real chance that a man would fall asleep at his post, and falling asleep on duty was considered to be such a serious offense that the penalty was death by firing squad.
What?
Nighttime also brought the need to...
What? Seriously, man, just by sleeping? Look, here's what I think. Just as a common sense, right? People usually, whenever I bring a subject like this up, people always comment down that time was different. It's not good for you to comment about this time while living in 21st century. Certain things are just, human psychology, whether it's 1,000 years ago or 100 years ago. And second of all, first of all, how do you come out as a good guy if you have something like this? Understand war is on. Understand every single point is crucial. Understand the entire country's entire country is on the line, right? This is as national security as it can get. It's a fucking world war. I understand that, but punishment should only be, that makes sense with, I guess, somewhat common sense, right? If somebody just sleeps, killing him, this is way too extreme. I would expect something like this from Nazi Germany, not around this by these people, right? If something is malicious, like traitor, somebody betraying their country, that I understand. Somebody just mistakenly went to sleep, I know it's pretty critical, right? Certain people could have really critical jobs that could hurt hundreds of people, hundreds of thousands of people, sure. But in the end, it's not malicious, right? If somebody just went to sleep, by killing him, what message are you sending? Like, doesn't matter what happened, don't sleep. If people can't sleep, they wouldn't. And if they slept during the gunfire in the trenches, it's because they had no other choice, right? They were so fucked that they had to sleep. I mean, this punishment doesn't make sense to me. I mean, it's a bit too extreme, I guess. But, to get around that, they basically made sure that nobody stays in that position for long enough time.
To patrol no man's land, man listening posts, and send out wiring parties. Occasionally, a patrol would meet an enemy patrol in the darkness, and they would each be faced with the decision of whether to fight or simply let the other pass. Such fighting, though, would be hand-to-hand, as gunfire would invite a burst from trench machine guns. It has been estimated that up to 1/3 of all Allied casualties on the Western Front were actually sustained in the trenches. To the men serving in them, death was a constant companion, even when it was quiet, and death came in many guises. In busy sectors, the constant shell fire brought random death. Many shelling casualties were buried alive, and those who couldn't be dug out suffered a terrible death indeed. All soldiers in the trenches also quickly learned to curb their natural inclination to peer over the parapet into no man's land. To do so was to invite a sniper's bullet. Disease also took a heavy toll in the trenches, as you may imagine, but no overview of life in the trench would be complete without mentioning the one overriding feature that instantly struck anyone visiting the lines: the appalling smell, which came from several sources, including rotting flesh. The dead could number in the thousands or even tens of thousands. It was often impossible to bury the dead immediately following a battle, and they would lie out in no man's land for days before they could be dealt with. In addition, many died in shell holes that filled up with water, or bodies simply sank into the mud. The stench of rotting flesh was a constant in life in the trenches. Overflowing latrines. The men would try and fill these in and dig new ones, but soon there was no room to dig new ones. Imagine how this was after 4 years. The stench of humanity.
Oh God, this just paints the picture. First of all, how does anybody with some form of OCD survives in the trenches, right? Because lots of soldiers obviously enlisted, but lots of soldiers had to be there conscription. So people who have some kind of a mental issues, right, like OCD and things, not some strong but light enough. The stench, right, constant reminder of death all around. How does a person cope with things like that? Because, OCD is the kind of thing, right? OCD comes in many forms, that it's a way too big, broad spectrum. But certain people with OCD cannot let certain things go. It is obsessive in the end. Right? OCD is So, certain people can literally tune themselves out to just, make sure that they don't go crazy staying in the trenches. But certain people with OCD can't do that. So all the smell, all the dead bodies lying around, holy shit. The trenches were, perfected in a way that it was a killing machine from all sides. A guy cannot peek out, a sniper could take your head off, right? You could encounter another, enemy party coming towards you in the dark. Should you attack or not? The smells and the constant shelling, right? Not to mention the level of PTSD would have. Shell shock basically. The trenches were horrendous. And after seeing all that, certain people obviously in their comfy chairs in the capital of a city thought, you know what? Let's introduce gas, right? Mustard gas. Fuck it. Because that's what they need. This was so horrible.
Men who had not been afforded the luxury of a bath in weeks or even months would, of course, smell. There was also the smell of disinfectant used to fight disease and infection, and the smells of battle, cordite, or the lingering hint of poison gas. The men on the lines actually grew used to this olfactory overload, but it would overcome first-time visitors to the front. There were also millions and millions of rats. If you're wondering what the men ate, food for soldiers in the trenches during World War I was at times a luxury. Getting hot food from the field kitchens to the frontline trenches could be impossible when a battle was imminent or in progress. Now, at the beginning of the war, soldiers got just over a pound of meat each, the same in bread, and a half pound of vegetables each day. But by 1917, the official ration was much smaller. Fresh meat was getting harder to come by, and the ration was reduced to just 6 ounces of bully beef. Common foods were makanaki stew and hard biscuits. All men received the same rations, and the ranks were always fed before the officers, although when able, the horses ate before both. There was no official vegetarian option, although provision was made for Indian personnel. There was very little waste, and leftovers were sold as swill to local farmers, while drippings were saved for use in manufacturing explosives. The key to success in the trenches was communication, and the mainstay in communications was the runner, who braved bullets and shells, mud and mayhem to take messages to and from forward positions. Although telephones were relatively commonplace, they relied on...
What a fucked up job, right? Fucked up duty as a runner. I mean, if if you play a video game where you have to run around while dodging shells and things, bombardment, right? It feels like, oh, that's badass. But even for the game, you're like, oh, that's too much. Real life, that was a job of somebody. That was duty of somebody, not job. It was fucking duty of somebody. God, that was just so horrible position, right? What was the mortality rate of runners? Did they constantly die? Because that's just fucked up.
On wires that were easily cut by shellfire or by accident. A big use for the telephone was from forward observation posts to spot for the artillery, and it was not a happy soldier who was told, in the face of shellfire and rifle bullets, to go out and trace and repair breaks in the telephone wires. It was vital, though, for without instant communication, a commander was in an impossible position. Radio was still a fairly new medium, but the wireless advantage was obvious, and it developed rapidly throughout the war, becoming quite sophisticated and common in the trenches by the end. Mud, rats, bad food, disease, dead bodies, unbearable smells, artillery shells, machine guns, no man's land, trench foot, and boredom. That, ladies and gentlemen, is what life in the trenches was like. I don't know about you, but I find it hard to imagine anything worse than the filth, the smell, and the depression of the trenches, with the constant threat of sudden death, and the psychological effect on the soldiers of the war was catastrophic. There is a romantic notion of war, but you won't find it here.
Romantic notion of war, come on.
The darkness crumbles.
Alright, there you go. Fucking hell. This is just as depressing a video as it can get. Because I'm a really visual person, right? I try to imagine scenarios as much as I can as soon as I hear about them. And this is as depressive as it can get. Every single place reminds you like, this is basically hell, right? At least in hell you're dead, so you're not gonna die again. This is not even hell, it's worse than that. Because there's a reminder that you are going to die, right? Sooner or later. Extreme high chances of you dying, basically. World wars and wars like this reminds you that humanity, when the time comes, can be really fucked up. And it doesn't align with your normal, societal thoughts and views and how do you live, right? Because the way we live right now, we can't comprehend how it becomes normal during the war times like this, right? Everybody just dying left and right. Oh, it's an everyday thing, because I've been seeing that for past 2-3 years. It's been 3 years since war started in the trenches. I know more of the trenches than I know of my home back in my hometown, I guess. That is so fucked up. Everybody's just dying left and right. It's normal. What is the smell? I don't know. Probably, latrines, filled up, so it's everywhere. It's probably that. Maybe a dead body is just, just somewhere in the water, and it's just decomposing. It's smelling like fuck. God, I can't even process that. It's just too fucked up. How does a person come out of that sane, right? People who survived this kind of a 4-year long trench warfare and went home. I don't even know. Were there many? Like somebody who entered the trenches at the start of the war. How many persons are there that came out of the trench warfare after 4 years or something? And I think that all of those persons, if there are any persons, who are like that, because I think, seeing the mortality rates, I think anybody who entered the trenches would have died in a few years before the war is over. There will be rarity that somebody entered the trenches and by the war is over after 4 years, they came out alive. And if there are some people like that, I bet all of them would have PTSD and would be, somewhat psychologically scarred, that they will never be normal or something like that. Because you can't survive shit like this and be normal. Just blend in like, war is over, I'm gonna be like just how I was before the war. That will never happen. This is so fucked up. Alright people, that was trench warfare in World War I. Only thing I think about is like, if World War III happens, anything that would happen, at least it won't be like this. I think it would be over quick because we have weapons that instantly kill people now. Nukes, smaller nukes, portable nukes, right? Even on the battlefield, there will be nukes dropping everywhere. The trenches wouldn't do shit, right? So at least with the modern technology, people would die like that rather than suffering. So that's the only positive I can think of. At least people in the future will not go through something like this. They would instantly die because that's the power we have right now. Alright, if you like my reaction, don't forget to like and subscribe. You'll be supporting my channel by subscribing, I guess, and I'll know which other videos to react to more. Right, the Great War, I'm getting, good enough views from this, so my viewers want to watch my reaction on the Great War. So sooner I'll start doing the World War II reaction of Indies 2 video, I guess. Which channel is that? World War II or something like that? I think I've seen that channel's name. Indies World War II channel. I think it's called World War II or something like that. Yeah, I don't think it's some name like Great War or something. It's just simply World War II. I'm going to start doing that as well. But, the more you like and subscribe, that is the way I'll know when to do what more, I guess. Alright, I'll see you next time.